Think about what you do every time you open a website. You type something like example.com and press enter, and almost immediately the page appears. It feels like nothing happened, but actually, that single click just started a journey through the internet. Now, here's the interesting part. You only see the web page. You don't see everything that happened before it appeared. Behind that screen, your browser has already started communicating with other computers, sending information, receiving information, and figuring out what it needs. And it all happens incredibly quickly. Think about how simple a website looks. Maybe there's some text, an image, and a few buttons. But behind that simple screen is a much bigger world. There are networks, routers, servers, databases, and huge amounts of data moving between them. So the web page you see is really just the final result of a much bigger process. So let's zoom in and follow just one tiny request. When you press enter, your browser needs to send a request toward the website. That request starts traveling through the network. It can pass through several different devices before reaching the server. And we're going to follow that journey. But there's a problem. Your browser doesn't know the physical location of the website. You didn't give it an IP address. You simply typed a name, example.com. So, how does the browser turn that simple name into a destination that computers can actually find? Meet DNS. DNS stands for Domain Name System. You can think of it as the Internet's directory. When you type a domain name, DNS helps find the IP address associated with that name. So instead of remembering a complicated number, you can simply remember a website name. DNS does the translation behind the scenes. Now the browser has a destination, but it still needs a way to get there. Your computer isn't directly connected to the website server. The request has to travel through a network of routers. Each router helps forward the data toward its destination. So your request is basically navigating through a huge digital road network. Once the browser reaches the right destination, it needs to communicate with the server. And when you're using HTTPS, that communication is protected. The browser and server establish a secure connection before exchanging information. So now we have a destination, a route, and a secure way to communicate. Now the browser can finally ask for the web page. It sends an HTTP request to the server. In simple terms, it's saying, I need this web page. The server receives that request and starts figuring out what information it needs to send back. And this is where the server starts doing some real work. The request might first reach a web server. Then the application may process it. And if the application needs information, it might ask a database. The database finds the required data, sends it back to the application, and the server prepares the response. All of that can happen before you even notice anything on your screen. Once the server has everything it needs, it sends a response back. Now the data starts traveling in the opposite direction. It moves through the network and eventually reaches your browser. So the journey that started with your request is now coming back to you as a response. But there's one thing you might not expect. The browser hasn't finished yet. What it receives isn't simply a finished picture of the web page. The browser has to interpret the information and figure out how everything should be displayed. So now, the browser itself starts doing some work. The browser starts building the page. It works out the structure. It applies the styling. It places the text and images. It figures out where the buttons and other elements should appear. And little by little, all of these pieces come together to create the web page you're looking at. And sometimes, the browser needs even more information. Maybe the page needs an image. Maybe it needs a particular font. Maybe it needs additional styles or scripts. So the browser can make more requests, receive those resources, and continue updating the page. That's why some websites appear gradually as different pieces finish loading. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture. You typed one simple URL, but behind that one action we had DNS, network routing, a secure connection, server processing, database activity, a response traveling back, and finally the browser rendering the page. That's a lot of work, just to show you a website. So how does all of this happen so quickly? Because modern computers and networks can process these operations incredibly fast. And many parts of the process can happen rapidly or even at the same time. That's why something involving so many different systems can feel almost instant to you. You press enter, and milliseconds later, you're looking at a web page. So let's put the entire journey together. You start with a URL. DNS helps find the destination. The request travels through the network. A secure connection is established. The server processes the request and may retrieve information from a database. The response travels back. And finally, your browser turns all of that information into the web page you see. One simple URL, an entire journey behind the screen. But there's still one big question. We know the request reaches a server, but what actually happens inside that database? How does a database find exactly the piece of information the application is looking for? How does it search millions or even billions of records so quickly? That's the next part of the story. In the next video, we're going inside a database to see what really happens when it receives a query.